Welcome.
Welcome,
everyone. BC Healthy Communities webinar on public engagement. And my name is Jody Muka, and I'm the Executive Director of BC Healthy Communities. So we'll just take a few minutes to let everyone get settled.
And I'm Jen Butcher with BC Healthy Communities as well, and I'll be leading the discussion today. So welcome everybody. I'm just scrolling through the names. I see some familiar names to myself that I've worked with in the past. So it's really nice to see some familiar names joining.
Great. Oh, Marnie Robinson, hello. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, Helene. Hi, Helene. It's been many years since I've seen and talked to you through our work together at DASH.
Pam Moore, hello.
And Amanda Ng, you and I, we went to school together. Hi, Amanda. It's wonderful. Carrie Wall. Hi, Carrie. So nice to see so many people joining today.
And Todd, hello. Amanda Ng, hello. It's awesome. So just a quick little bit of housekeeping. You're probably well aware of this. I'm sure everyone's zoomed out as of this point in time, but down at the bottom, there's the chat box, and that's where you can introduce yourself if you like. If you know the territory that you're joining from, feel free to add that as well. Give you a few minutes to add comments in there in that chat function. And then on the bottom right-hand part of the screen is our Q&A, and we have Jacob, our research and planning assistant, monitoring that. And so as you have questions throughout the webinar, I highly suggest typing them into the Q&A as those questions come up, and Jacob's monitoring those. And at the end of the webinar, if we have the opportunity to, we'll pull some of those and have our panelists and Jen answer as many of them as we can. So we'll be checking that regularly. Oh, great, look at this. A lot of people know which territory they're joining from, which is fantastic. Someone's from Cheryl from Campbell River. Hello. It's great. Oh my gosh, we have someone from Tennessee joining. Katie, that's pretty cool. Curious how you even found out about this webinar. It's awesome. And Glennis from District of Saanich. Hi. That's awesome. Wonderful. Well, welcome everyone. So as we're getting settled, we'll begin the webinar in just a few minutes, just letting everyone log on to make sure everyone's able to access the technology. One of the other things that I'll mention is that we are doing some live tweeting. Our Healthy Communities Planner, Emily Johnson, is manning our tweet booth and is live tweeting, you know, any kind of interesting phrases, key topics, you know, things that really catch our interest. So you can feel free to reshare, you can tweet as well. We are at BC_HC on Twitter, and we have a hashtag for this webinar, and it's #Equitable Engagement. So you can follow along. The other thing that I'll let you know is that we are recording this webinar, and there will be resources that we're discussing that will be made available and sent out at the end of the webinar. So if you have coworkers that are not able to join today, this webinar is available for anyone after we're complete today. So we'll be sending out an email with the link and any resources that we discuss and refer to during the course of this 1-hour webinar. And then the other thing is we also through PlanH develop a suite of action guides, and several months back we did publish and launch an engagement, Healthy Communities Engagement Action Guide. So that link will also be sent out. We'll be referring to some of that throughout the webinar. All right, excellent. Well, thank you. So many attendees. We've got 139 folks joining us as of right now, so that is fantastic. I'll get us started this morning. So welcome, everyone. This webinar this morning is hosted by BC Healthy Communities, and it's through our PlanH program, which I'll share a little bit more about as we move forward. But really the focus is equitable public engagement, and it's focused on navigating power when engaging underrepresented populations. And as I shared earlier, I'm Jody Muka. I'm the Executive Director of BC Healthy Communities. I've worked with the organization since its inception in 2005. And yeah, thank you. Thanks everyone for joining us today. I know there's many things that are going on, and we really appreciate and acknowledge the time that you're spending with us this morning for this important topic and discussion. Again, I flagged a few technical aspects of the webinar, the Q&A and the chat box at the bottom, and that we will be recording this. So we really look forward to joining you in this discussion this morning. Let's go to this next slide here. Yeah, acknowledgements. So I grew up in a small interior community in BC that is known as Balfour. It's on Kootenay Lake. I am British and Czechoslovakian descent. I'm the eldest of 3. I'm the only girl. I have younger brothers. And the territory that that community is within is the Ktunaxa, the lands of the Ktunaxa's people. And that is an area and territory that spans that lower southern part of the lower part of BC and the northern part of the US, just so it crosses the border in that area. And for the past 20 years, I've been living and working in Victoria. That's where our central BC Healthy Communities central office is, and that is the unceded traditional territory of the Lekwungen peoples. So acknowledging that we are blessed to be able to live, work, play, and work on these lands. So we'll go to the next slide. Just a little bit about BC Healthy Communities. We've been around since 2005. We are a provincial organization, and we offer a range of programs, resources, tools, and fee-for-service offerings across the province. And our team is comprised of community engagement experts, healthy community planners, public health practitioners, and our work is really the intersection of planning and public health. So we're thrilled to have you join us for this webinar today. This is part of our PlanH program, and the PlanH program specifically provides a grant program, tools and resources to support collaborations between local governments, health authorities, Indigenous communities, all in the name of healthy communities and community health and well-being strategies. So let's just move to the next slide, where I will give you a sense of how this webinar is going to go this morning. So today's webinar, the format is that it's a facilitated discussion. So we have our community well-being, Jennifer Butcher, facilitating the discussion, and we have 3 panelists, and Jen will introduce our panelists. And we're going to start first by unpacking the concept of equity. What is equitable public engagement? And we'll break down what we actually mean by equitable public engagement. And then next we'll dive a little deeper into the role of power as it relates to equitable engagement and equitable engagement processes. And then finally, we're going to spend a good portion of our time talking about what does this mean in practice? What does it mean on the ground? And the conversation with our 3 panelists, you'll get a sense of some really good examples of some of the things that they've done in their work. And then to close at the end of the webinar, we're going to ask you, we'd love to get your feedback. So we'll have a brief survey, take 5 minutes of your time. And really that allows us to hear from you about, you know, how was this webinar for you and what we can do to improve our offerings to better support you in your work across the province. All right, so is everyone ready to get going on this webinar? I'm going to introduce you to Jennifer Butcher, our community well-being facilitator. So Jen has 10 years experience in the field. She's done engagement work for many years, and that work in particular has spanned across a range of different topic areas from food security, inclusion and diversity, healthy schools, and even collective impact. And she's our team process expert. She's amazing at curriculum design and really understands the needs of communities and brings a real keen skill in facilitating engaging discussions. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Jen, and you can say a little bit more about yourself and introduce our 3 fantastic panelists this morning. So thank you, and over to you, Jen.
Thanks, Jody. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. I'm just noticing this profile picture up here that was obviously taken pre-kids. So I look very nicely rested in this photo. So my name is Jen. I'm a community wellbeing specialist at BC Healthy Communities, as Jody mentioned. I have been immersed in the world of partnership development and community engagement for several years, working primarily across the sectors of health, education, and government. A bit about myself and my background. I'm of Irish, Scottish, and Métis descent. I'm joining you today from where I gratefully call home, on land that remains governed by the Tsleil-Waututh First Nations people in North Vancouver, BC. And I am so excited and honored to introduce our 3 panelists today. So they'll be joining us in conversation a little later this morning. But first we have Charla Huber. Charla's the Director of Communications and Indigenous Relations for Macola Housing Society and is established in the field of Indigenous relations. She's a key player at Macola in building relationships with First Nations and facilitating relationships with municipalities, businesses, and organizations. So we're extremely excited to have Charla with us today. Ruth Solentich is the Communications and Public Engagement Specialist with the District of Lake Country. So Ruth has worked with a variety of diverse and underrepresented stakeholder groups in her over 26-year career in the field of community engagement and communications. And in 2019, she was awarded the Business Leader of the Year from the Kitimat Chamber of Commerce for her outstanding role as Senior External Relations Advisor for the LNG Canada project. And finally, we have Sue Wheeler. She's the Social Development Manager with the City of Kelowna. And Sue has worked in municipal government settings, providing leadership in the areas of community development and social planning for many years. And most recently on the community-based Journey Home strategy, which is to address, local homelessness in the City of Kelowna. And we are so thrilled to have Ruth and Sue with us here as well today. So, before we dive into what equitable public engagement processes look like, I wanted to take a couple minutes here to poll you, the audience, on your current level of comfort with, and for some reason I would like to do this, I think I may have to stop sharing my screen in order to get this poll going. So here we go. So I have this poll launched here, and it's about the familiarity with the topic of equitable public engagement. And we're just really trying to get a good sense of where people are at before we begin. Lots of responses coming in here. So people are generally somewhat familiar with the topic, and that's really great. We are going to be diving into the topic a little bit deeper here today. So hopefully you'll be improving your familiarity and awareness of equity, equitable public engagement, and the role of power in that. And there's also a number of links to resources that are being posted live in the chat box as we discuss. So if you really want to take a deeper dive into any of this, beyond what we have time to share with you during the webinar, please check out those links, and they'll also be available after the webinar as well. So I'm just going to go back and share my screen once again here so that we can get into the topic of equity here. So in order to have that conversation about equitable public engagement, we do need to talk about the idea of equity itself. And so I always feel like it's a good idea to kind of land on that concept with a bit of clarity first before we talk about what it looks like in practice. So equity can be understood as the fair distribution of opportunities, resources, and power to meet the needs of all people, regardless of age, ability, gender, and background. So all of these elements are important when it comes to ensuring an equity lens is applied to the work that we're doing with communities, that engagement work. But it's that power element and the intentional actions that we take to empower those who are marginalized or hard to reach in our communities that is key to enabling those opportunities to become available to those who are underserved, and ensuring resources are allocated in a way that prioritizes the voices of the marginalized over the, so to speak, usual suspects that tend to be involved. So most of the time, when we seek to engage with underrepresented populations, what we're really doing is we're offering equitable opportunities to be involved in the process. That is usually what ends up happening. Sometimes we see the redistribution of resources occurring so that engagement processes are developed in a way that prioritizes the incorporation of hard to reach voices. So this might look like a shift away from spending funds to organize a town hall meeting and instead increasing budget for engagement of marginalized community members in their community at a place of their choosing. That would be reallocation of resources to support an equity lens to be applied. And less often still, we see an intentionality embedded in the earliest phases of engagement planning that strives to actually create a process that is driven by hard to reach voices, and in a way that positions them as experts of knowledge and experience, and as a result positions us as the learners, the ones being given that gift of their expertise. So we're going to learn a lot more about what this looks like in practice from our panelists as we dive into that topic a little bit further. And I just wanted to bring up this image here to show that there's a difference between equity and equality in public engagement. Some people might not have seen this one. It's here we're seeing that equality, and I'm going to be relating this to public engagement here. It's providing all community members with the same access to participate in public engagement processes. And that's shown here by the two ladders of equal height. But even though the two people here are given equal access to opportunities, the level of opportunities available to them isn't fairly distributed. So those who are marginalized or underserved by society will always be disproportionately impacted by an engagement process that we develop. So an equitable process prioritizes their involvement and input, but reducing barriers to participation, as shown here, isn't enough. We need to work towards actually designing our engagement processes to allow that to happen. So it starts from the beginning. It's an intentional embedment in the process that allows that equity lens to actually surface, and it needs to be intentional at every stage of the process. So thinking about when you're developing these processes, and what we do in our work too, is who is going to be most impacted by the decisions that we're making and why? How do I ensure I prioritize the voices of those who will be most impacted? And what do we need to do and plan for to ensure that that happens in the entire development of an engagement process? There's a lot of intentionality putting in there. So I encourage you all to check out a link that will have been posted in the chat box. if you're interested in taking a deeper dive into the concepts of equity versus equality as per this image that's been posted here, because there's a lot more to it than what we have time to go through today. So we are just about to turn our attention over to our panelists, but before I do, I wanted to take a minute to set us up for a conversation around the role of power and empowerment in equity. And this will allow us to dive into that conversation about how to apply an equity lens in a practical setting. So what does it mean to say that we want to empower a community in our engagement process? So to empower the community in the process means placing the decision-making authority in their hands. So it's saying, we trust you, we're here to learn from you, and we will implement what you decide is best to support your own community. So it means not having a predetermined conclusion in mind for what we want the end result of engagement to be. So you're genuinely interested in what the public has to say and have an honest intention to be responsive to what you're hearing, no matter what that might be. So we as organizations seeking to incorporate the voices of our community need to be willing to actually shift our mindsets from a knower and an expert to a learner and have that trust in the community. We have to position ourselves as the ones asking questions and really listen to what's being said. We also have to be authentic in our intentions, which means asking ourselves, what do I intend to do with this information that is being given to me? We have to be willing to relinquish control over the process, which can feel uncomfortable sometimes, especially if we're not used to doing it, but allowing that process to be iterative, allowing the community to build their own capacity to create change that will impact their own health and well-being is what we need to be doing if we're interested in exploring that empowerment piece. So being a convener and being an advocate are central and so important to that, rather than being a facilitator. Creating the space for the conversations to happen and protecting that space, and then kind of getting out of the way. So we'll hear more about the importance of that convener versus facilitator role from Sue, as she shares her learnings from the Kelowna Lived Experience Circle. And I encourage you again to check out the links that we're posting in that chat box if you want to dive into this a little bit deeper. So let's dive into the conversation as we meet our three esteemed panelists who will be sharing their experience and strategies for applying these elements of equity and power into public engagement practice. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen at this point, and we can see all of us, our panelists here today. If we can unmute ourselves and welcome Ruth and Sue and Charlotte to the conversation. So as I've just kind of talked about, with these kind of more high-level conceptual pieces around equitable engagement and what that is from a kind of a definitive standpoint, I'm really curious to know, and I think I'll pose this question to Sue first. What does equitable engagement look like in practice from your experience?
Well, thank you for that. I think that where it begins is really recognizing that there are barriers to participation by certain populations, and that our traditional structures of engagement have been rooted in things like stigma. So getting to recognizing that and being diligent and intentional on addressing them. And I think that understanding what the barriers are locally to whatever population that you're trying to engage is really key. And I believe that understanding that starts by conversations in the community with people that have that local knowledge and local understanding, to understand what those barriers are and how you can overcome them. And then the next thing is being intentional, like you said, in investing in planning and resources. Knowing that you're going to need additional resources to engage certain populations is key. So that staff resources could be dollars, etc. In our community, we worked to engage people with lived experience of homelessness, and we started out with the frontline workers that really knew this population, and they gave us such good guidance on understanding what the barriers were, like being able to find a place where people could convene, where they didn't have any kind of previous negative experiences, where it was a neutral place, being inclusive, bringing everyone, like opening the door for everyone to come, and providing supports and approaches that allowed people to feel comfortable to participate. So
and can you just explain in like for a minute to backtrack a bit about that Kelowna lived experience circle to sort of give a bit of context? We didn't really get a chance to do that.
For sure. So the lived experience circle on homelessness really became our approach to ensure equitable engagement, and really looking at ways to support equity and power in contributing to community-driven solutions around solving homelessness. So recognition that the people with lived experience of homelessness are the experts. They understand, you know, they just have such a great understanding of where the barriers are and what the solutions are. And so we were able to convene a conversation. And I think you mentioned earlier that our people that were guiding us told us that, you know, these are the experts. They don't need a facilitator. They just need someone to convene them and bring them together. So we hired a person with lived experience to be the convener of a group and start a conversation. And out of that process, they developed a vision, goals and action plans about how they wanted to participate. And they were able to now have established an organization called the Lived Experience Circle on Homelessness that has sits at key tables and all decision-making tables really around homelessness. Their guidance is foundational to any conversation that we have in the community now. They were foundational to how the Journey Home strategy unfolded and now how it's being implemented. And I think that what really happened in our community was a cultural change, a shift in the paradigm of engagement and how we do things and how we have those conversations in our community and how we make decisions. And it's now been embedded across the sector. And no conversation starts without the lived experience guidance. And they have mechanisms in place where they're able to go out and gather input and feedback from people that are actually living, experiencing homelessness right now, and bring that back to conversations. And I know we're going to talk about COVID later, but I can't tell you how phenomenal it was to have that input so that we could really respond to needs on the ground during the COVID period. So
thank you. And Charla, a little bit about the work that you do, and then also your kind of take on what equitable engagement looks like in practice, building off of Sue's there.
Sure. So I work for Macola Housing Society, and we're the largest Indigenous affordable housing provider in British Columbia. And part of my role in the Indigenous relations piece of my role is to make sure that we're honoring and respecting and working with Indigenous communities everywhere that we operate. So when we're building a new project or starting something new in a region, I find out whose traditional territory the project is taking place on. And I find that out by calling local nations and asking. I don't try and use a graph or a website, like I go right to the nations and find out. And when we reach out to a nation, I ask 3 questions. And my 3 questions are, how do we properly acknowledge your traditional territory? How can we honor your nation? And how can we include you in this project? And the responses that I receive, it's my job to make that happen. And I think that for equitable engagement, I think it's really important that you're doing the work for the right reason, that it's not just to tick the box to say that I've done that. And I think too, even before engaging, even if someone knows they want to reach out to a local nation and ask for some input, I think it's really important to first ask yourself and say, why am I engaging? and not just because it's the right thing to do. Like really dig deep and find out, why am I engaging? And then the next step is what is the outcome I'm hoping to achieve? And then the third piece of that is this mutually beneficial? And I strongly believe in things being mutually beneficial. So if someone's reaching out to a nation or a community or a person or anybody, to make sure that that engagement benefits both parties. And I think that if it doesn't benefit both parties, then you really need to take a step back and rework the first two questions.
Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to flag before we move on, I am noticing in that chat box they're being asked to repeat the 3 questions that you asked. Would you mind taking a second to just go by? It sounds like people are really interested in writing them down.
Sure. So the first question is, how do we properly acknowledge your traditional territory? And I like to ask this question because I feel that a lot of us are doing territorial acknowledgements and trying, but I think it's a great step as introducing yourself and really finding out the words that you are using if a nation or an Indigenous community wants you, if that's the words they say. And not every nation responds with, here's the language that we would like, but I feel it's important to ask. The next question is, how can we acknowledge your nation? Or how can we honor your nation? Either works. And some ways in that people may ask, we've had some projects where they say, we would like youth art included in this project, or we would like our dancers to come to your grand opening, or whatever the question is. So how would that nation like to be represented within that? And the third question is, how can we include you in this project? And some of those still might be the same answers of, we want youth art included in this project. And sometimes the answer is just, thank you for asking, right? Like, you're not always going to get requests with the questions, but I feel it's very important that if you're willing to ask the questions, that you're actually willing to action them. Because if someone comes back with an answer and you're not willing to do it, that's also worse than not asking in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Right. Thank you so much, Darla. And Ruth, over to you to give just a brief little backgrounder to kind of give a bit of context for the work that you're involved in, and then also your take on what equitable engagement looks like in practice from your experience.
Sure. Good morning, everyone, and thanks, Jen and the team at BCHC for being here today. I appreciate the invitation. You know, your slides definitely summarized a lot of great key points, and I agree with everything that was outlined, as well as to Sue and to Charla. You've just really nailed it, and I don't have a whole lot more to add to your expertise, but just working, I've done a large shift, as you mentioned, Jen, in the intro, from working from, you know, 20 plus years in the oil and gas industry, major projects that impact a whole variety of stakeholders in the community with different interests. So that's been extremely interesting. And then moving to municipal government. So I'm with the District of Lake Country now, Sue's neighbor to the north, sandwiched between Kelowna and Vernon. So we're a growing community, and we have a lot of initiatives on the go. A lot of them impact many in the community, but as many of the those on the line today on the webinar who are with municipal government, you just really experience engagement fatigue and stakeholder fatigue. So recognizing that there are so many groups that we need to reach out to, and especially those who are going to be impacted and who may not be represented properly, and that you really need to have, I like the word you used, Jen, have that authentic engagement. And I get really tripped up on the word engagement versus consultation. And as Jen brought out, it's because you have to set the expectation early as to whether this engagement, these conversations that you're going to have with these groups is really going to be taken into consideration and will impact the end result. So I think that's extremely important. But just to even take another step back, I just find time and time again, and we hear about this in theory, but not a lot of people do it in practice, but really starting early. So as soon as an initiative or a program or a project is on the books, you really need, you and your team, or if you're a one-person show, is to really identify your stakeholders and do a really strong, robust, and spend a lot of time at the front end of identifying who your stakeholder groups are. And out of each of those groups comes who are the leaders. Some of them are the silent ones. So, you know, again, not being Indigenous, but working with many Indigenous communities is really taking the time to develop the relationship, develop the trust, get to know them. And again, that takes time. So if you're just doing a box checking exercise, this isn't going to work. So if you think even a project or initiatives on the horizon, you really need to spend the time at the front end, understanding who your stakeholders are and spending the time to develop those relationships and to really earn that trust. It's not just about, as Charlotte mentioned, what's in it for me, but it has to be a two-way benefit. It can't just be about industry or the municipality getting what they need and what they want. It really has to engage and encourage your underrepresented population to understand. They're not always going to agree, but to at least have that meaningful conversation and that engagement.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, all of you, for giving a bit of context around that. I would like to go back to Charlotte for a second and kind of build off of what you were just talking about earlier around those three questions. So Charlotte, when you are reaching out to local nations for projects that you're working on, what is important as part of that process for you that you can share?
Yeah, I think the big thing comes from respect and doing things in a good way, and definitely not just asking a question for the sake of asking the question, and actually looking for guidance and answers and things that can help us do work in better ways. And I think an example of that would be a lot of times when events are happening, and I know right now they're not happening, but before they were happening, and something would happen and someone would say, oh, we should get an elder to do a blessing. And I'm sure everyone on this Zoom has heard someone say that at some point. And I like to switch that up a little bit. And when you can say, how would you like to participate? Then we're not the ones, and I'm an Indigenous person, but still being Indigenous, I don't want to dictate to someone else what their culture is. So if I say, how would you like to participate? And we've had amazing different things. We have had elders come and give blessings, or dancers come and perform, or speakers come. And we learn so much more about people's culture and the importance and how it needs to be done, instead of making that small box of saying, we're having this, so we need an elder to do a blessing. And I think that just comes from that piece of respect and from learning. So if you make space for people to come and participate how they want and to be acknowledged how they want, and then you'll learn a lot more from that too. And one of our events for the grand opening of the building that I'm in right now is on the traditional territory of 8 different nations. And at that day, I ensured, and we had representatives from each nation here. And one thing I hadn't thought about is everyone looked at each other and they had said, wow, look at all of us who are here. And had said, so often there's one Indigenous person there representing all Indigenous people. And it was well received that we had each nation represented as they wanted to. And that was a learning lesson for me too. And then as you can do things in a respectful way and demonstrate to nations that you're willing to take that extra step and do, and it doesn't even be First Nations, it could be any community that you're working with. But when you take that extra step to listen and to learn and to make it happen, people will know that you're doing things for the right reason, and those relationships will evolve. And the first few times it might take a lot of work and a lot of extra steps to demonstrate that you're doing things for the right way. But when people really get to see and understand that you are doing things in a good way, then every other time it gets easier and easier, because you don't have to keep proving your authenticity.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And that's really what kind of helps guide that process towards that empowerment piece, is when you're starting it off with that intentionality and that authenticity. And I'm here to hear from you as to how you want to be engaged. What do you want? What do you want this to look like? That is tapping into that empowerment piece. And so, Sue, I'm really curious, in your own work with the Kelowna Lived Experience Circle, how has empowerment played a role in engaging with the community members that you are aiming to reach through that?
So what I would say is that it began with an intentionality, that this was not just about gathering input to build a strategy that the community would own. It was about creating a shift in the way we do things. And so it was, our intentionality was to create mechanisms so that the lived experience population that was experiencing homelessness would have mechanisms and structures in place that ongoing they would be providing guidance, and that in fact is what's happened. We have structures in place now where there's now embedded in the way we do things is a belief that people with lived experience have the most knowledge and expertise and to bring to the conversation, to create change in the community, to create solutions. But I think I just want to tap in on something that Ruth brought up, and that's around building trust. And I think that that was instrumental in our process, supporting our process to go forward, because in working with the Lived Experience Circle, we had to demonstrate that we were going to listen, and that that they would be believed. And they actually, one of our processes that we had was when they were having their conversations, and this came from our local knowledge group, that we had a graphic illustrator capture their conversations, and the illustrator did that visually, and they were able to take those visual pictures and share them at decision-making tables. And one that I remember was one that said, "Believe us. We need you to believe us." And I think that that was key, was in being able to demonstrate that they were being listened to and that they were going to guide us, and then helping them move into that leadership role where they could actually lead us in creating those changes. And so some of the things that I think were really key was supporting them as a group to develop their vision and their goals and where they wanted to go and how they wanted to actually create that change in the community. And I talked about having the convener earlier, but I think it was about really demonstrating that they could have impact. They were having impact. And when we started any conversation in the community, it started with them. They were the foundation. They were the people that stood at the front of the room and did the education piece and guided the conversations, and allowing them to do it just shifted, I think, the power of within the, it made it more equitable, and the learning across the community was significant. Some of the things that we did early on to really demonstrate how important their voices were was let them help plan the meetings. And one of the things that happened was we took those meetings out of traditional settings. We put them around a meal and people getting to know each other in a different way before they even had the discussion. And so it just really was about changing the way we did things, for sure. And I think that at the end of the day, what we've been able to do is create a real shift in the community. And one thing I wanted to mention to my other municipal colleagues that are on the call is that, this has created such a paradigm shift in how we're working. But I think it's really important that you bring the rest of your municipal colleagues along in this journey. And so one of the things that we did was find champions in other departments, and they came to those processes. Even if it only touched on a piece of their work, they came and they engaged. And the amount of change that's happened in the community and within our own municipal structure as a result, it's been transformational. And because those champions went back to their departments and shared their learnings, and there's just such a different approach. So now we have our community safety department and our bylaw department. When they have an idea on something they want to do, they go to the Lived Experience Circle first and say, "Hey, what do you think?" And it's been a phenomenal process, and we've had so many more successes as a result. I truly believe that.
Right. Thank you so much, Sue, for that. And I'm just kind of wondering, I've seen a couple of questions come up in the chat box, and I think I'm hoping will kind of speak to that a little bit. For Ruth, do you have any advice that you can share for others today that are seeking to engage hard to reach voices on projects with very limited timeframes, limited resources? How do we ensure that we are able to reach those voices in an authentic way and avoid tokenism in those circumstances when you're kind of pressed for time, pressed for resources, and that you don't kind of fall into that way?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, the $1 million question. That doesn't matter who you represent or who you're working for, whether you're a contractor or you work for the municipality or a major project. We're always grappling with that one. But I think my biggest advice, and it's really not anything amazing, but is not to stick to the status quo. You know, just be creative. Think outside the box. And I know those are really cliche things to say, but it's true. And I think my best ideas have come really when I wasn't really thinking about it. It could be on a weekend, or, you know, just going for a hike, or doing something completely not work related. But then you might see a group of people engaging in a way that you never thought of. And just don't be scared to challenge what maybe people before you did, or what your organization has always done just because, and no one's ever questioned it. So I would just really encourage you to get creative. And if it doesn't work, that's okay. Just move on to the next idea. And your stakeholders will appreciate that. I think my other biggest learning, and it's only come with maturity and having two extremely loud children, is kids just want, well, everyone wants to be heard. Everyone has a story to tell. Sometimes it's easier to get stories out of people or life experiences than others, but really learn to draw people out, because once someone starts talking, it's really hard to get them to stop, and that's okay, because you need that background, you need that experience to really understand someone's perspective or their point of view. So, you know, again, just really simple things that are not life-shattering, but if you apply them, your project or your initiative will just go so much better. And the last thing I want to add, and you know, Sue did a really great job in summarizing it, and I really appreciate the points that she outlined, but your internal team, whoever that is, whether it's the engineers or the bylaw officers, or, you know, whoever it is, doesn't matter, whatever organization you represent, you always have a team of people that you're working with. And you might be the forward face to the community, but irregardless, you need to bring them along, because they need to have patience. These things don't happen overnight. So if there's some schedule slippage, well, that's the way it is, but they need to appreciate it and understand in the long run, this is for their benefit as well, or for the whole team's benefit. Mm-hmm. But I love how Sue brought out the point that they get involved, they understand, they're more sympathetic, especially if you're living in a small community like I was, where everyone was your community outreach, didn't matter who they were. So they need to understand the impacts of their behavior, their speech, their influences within the community, and what reach they have to representing an initiative or a project. So really spend a lot of time internally. We often oversee that. We don't view our internal group as a stakeholder, but make them #1 priority, because they're your advocates.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ruth. Before we get to I would love to get to some of these amazing questions that are popping up in the chat box here. I've got one more question that I feel we could probably hit on 1 or 2 people to respond. With regards to meaningfully engaging underrepresented or marginalized voices during this current COVID period, can anybody share some successful ways that you've been able to modify your approaches to ensure that those members of the community are still reached?
Yeah, happily share. So pre-COVID, when I would reach out to nations, I would always go in person, and because I was taught that in Indigenous communities, important conversations are had in person, and I would never call ahead, and I would bring a letter and a gift and introduce myself at that time. And it's always been the best received. Even if members of Chief and Council weren't there at the time, they would see my letter and my gift and know that I came to do things in a good way. And with COVID now and a lot of nations closing their doors to outsiders, that's not necessarily the best approach. And I've reached out to a couple chiefs just asking to say, hey, like normally we go in person and people are asking me for how can they engage now, and I don't think that's appropriate. And what Chief PlanH of Sauk Nation told me is he suggested that people, if they have any connection to anyone in the nation, to maybe reach out to that person and say, I have this project, or I'm looking to connect with someone. Do you have any advice on who I can connect with, and maybe get that internal person to connect them with an individual? I think if you don't have that in, maybe even calling the band office and not trying to launch your project, but saying, I would like to, I have a letter and a gift introducing ourselves for your chief and council, and I would like to know the best way to get it to them. Like, can I drop it off? Should I mail it? And recently I was doing some engagement work with some nations in Ontario, and I'm in Victoria. And I talked with one of the chief of Six Nations, Chief Mark Hill, who talked to me about getting a box and sending it to the various nations in Ontario I was trying to engage with traditional medicines in there, and send the letter. And so that is the method that I've chosen. And the idea there was, when someone receives this box and can open it with a letter beautifully presented with the traditional medicines that the nations in Ontario use, then someone would see that care and respect and consideration was taken when presenting that letter. So after COVID, I would always suggest going in person, but I think however you can get your message across, demonstrating care and thought put into it, I think is better than just sending an email or leaving a voicemail.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Sue, do you have any last minute things you can add there
Yeah.
about?
Sure. Thank you, Charla, for that. That was great. I would just add that, you know, and I think this is kind of what you were touching on, is it's about choice. And so providing space and choice for people has been really important for our lived experience members throughout COVID. So there is an opportunity to gather in a physical distancing way, or there is an online opportunity, but also recognizing that some people just do not choose to engage at this time, and respecting that. I would say that the Lived Experience Circle and their consultation with people living on the streets around COVID has been key in some of the work that's unfolded as a result. So understanding what's the needs are on the street has resulted in things like us developing a street survival guide that's specific to COVID, opening a hygiene center for those that have had to shelter outdoors, as the shelters have had to reduce the number of people inside, and developing washroom and access to water plan has been really key. So they've been able to continue their work in a way that respects the parameters of social distancing, etc. It's been difficult. We're still learning. And of course, now with the recent surge in cases, there's a pullback again. So, but you know, we're working as hard as we can, because their guidance at this time is even more important than ever. So we'll continue to work on that.
Thank you. Thank you guys so much for that. I would like to get to a question or two if we can. There's been so many that have come up, and I wish we had 2 hours to address all of it. If you do have any specific questions for the panelists that you really would like to know, and we don't have time to get to them today, please do email. There's emails that have been provided. We will post them again after the webinar. Or you can reach out to us at BC Healthy Communities, and we can guide you in the right direction there, because it's all very important. So I do have, there is a question here that says, from Anonymous, do you have advice on how to engage in an equitable, authentic way to further into the project's life cycle, i.e. when engagement wasn't equity driven at the outset? What are some strategies to consider to make up for lost time, as opposed to saying it's too little too late? So I know that isn't the case. You don't have to say, whoops, we'd forgotten, no, I can't do it. Can't do it at all. But is anybody able to speak to that? How do you kind of make up that when you haven't started out on the right foot?
Well, I'll, if you don't mind, I'll just add a few experiences there. That question's great, because that does happen, especially if you don't necessarily identify certain stakeholders at the front end of an initiative, and it's bound to happen. I think your biggest way to rectify it is acknowledge that, don't deny it. And again, start establishing a trusting relationship with that stakeholder group. And you might be too far down the path to really incorporate meaningful engagement. But again, acknowledging that and building that trust and that respect and listening. Again, key is listening. They may have certain issues that have already been resolved, but they just want you to hear it from their position or from their viewpoint. So just, again, taking the time, the gift of time is always a huge thing, and it goes far, and building that trust that it won't happen again.
Great. Thank you so much, Ruth, for speaking to that. I can also say in my experience as well, it's never too late. Again, yes, acknowledge that it has not been, the process has not been developed with that empowerment or equity lens to date. I would typically ask the community, what has not been working well for you so far? Again, acknowledging that the process has not been one that's been done properly to date. What has not been, what has that made you feel? What would you like to see differently? How can we move forward in a way that makes you feel heard, involved? Again, going back to what all three panelists have been saying, and I feel like this does speak to a number of the questions that have been popping up. It's about asking the community what they want, what they need, how they want to be involved, what they want to see happen. And that speaks to a question I've seen posted up about the power piece, that empowerment, that recognizing you do come into that relationship situated in a seat of power, and to relinquish that, as I've posted up in the slides earlier. You need to just be comfortable with situating yourself as a learner and saying, we understand and recognize that you are the ones that have that experiential knowledge, that you are the ones that are bringing that to the table. And we're just here to learn. We're just here to hold the space for you. What do you need? And how can we make that happen for you? What do we need to do here?
Can I just add one thing?
Please.
I actually think it can end up being a very valuable learning experience for everyone, because I've seen it happen. If you can be open to revisiting discussions that have maybe already happened, things can actually get flipped totally around with this new lens coming into a conversation, and it can end up being so much more valuable as a result, and everyone learns from that. So I actually think it ends up being a learning experience, and like Ruth says, recognizing it and being transparent about your error and going from there. So I think it just helps in building that understanding across the community.
Great, thank you so much. We are just about out of time today, so I just want to move us along to the final steps of our webinar today. So what we can expect post-webinar. Again, I want to thank you guys so much for joining us. We are going to be sending out a curated list of resources and supplemental learnings and tools that all the things that have been posted in that chat box, all the links that have been posted, you're going to get that via email, so that you can continue to learn with your organizations and across organizations. We'll send you a link to the webinar recording, and I encourage you to share that with your colleagues. And for those who have consented to their contact information being shared when you registered, we want you to be able to continue the conversation and learning with each other post this webinar, so you'll receive that contact list as well. So I'm just going to hand it over to Jody now to close out the webinar today.
Jen. Oh, thanks, Jen, and really thank you, Ruth, Charla, Sue, for the engaging discussion today, and a special thank you to all of those who joined us as attendees. We are really thrilled to see the number of you joining us, and some really rich discussion and questions posted. So as Jen said, we will be sharing that information at the end of this webinar, so you can share the link to webinar itself and all the resources. And then the other thing that we'll share with you is the contact information of each of our 3 panelists. So if you would like to reach out to them in particular with questions, there were some really great questions in the chat box there, so you can contact them directly. And what's going to happen when you click to leave the webinar is a quick survey will pop up, and you have the opportunity to fill it out. It'll take max 5 minutes. We would really appreciate if you would take the time to do that. And if it doesn't work for you to do it at this time, the link to the survey will also be sent out in the email with the follow-up information. And again, it provides us with information on how we can improve our services and anything that we're developing to share back and help to build on your capacity for building healthier communities. So again, you can go onto Twitter, you can see the tweets at #EquitableEngagement, and feel free to share those. And just again, to close, we really sincerely appreciate and value the time and attention that you brought to us for this 1-hour webinar. So thank you again for joining us, and I'm now declaring our webinar complete. We look forward to being in touch with you into the future. Thanks so much, everyone.